Hey everybody, and welcome to a Game Dev Topic of the Week video. So this video we're going to be talking a little bit about sorting and how I handle sorting in Unity for a top-down game, which can get a little bit complicated. So this is a little bit of a follow-up to a video that I already did as part of my Taiji game development log series. So I'm just going to put a little link up in the corner of the screen so you can go check that out. You'll want to skip to the topic of the week section because, of course, it's a development log, so the first part of the video is just going to be me talking about what I did that week. So, in that, just to recap very briefly, in case you didn't watch that one, in that one we basically just talked about how you might handle sorting with like trees or things like that, where the player can walk around it. Apologies that the frame rate is a little bit low because I wanted to have this preview window here as well so that we can talk about that in a second. So this time what I want to talk about is how you handle stuff like this bridge here that the player can walk under, but of course they can walk up also and come back around and then walk over it. So what you see on the bottom is actually like the game view, and what you see on top is a view that basically just shows the colliders and the triggers. So these pink lines here are these walls, so that prevents you from moving out there. You'll see like when I want to run into the wall, there's this like little raycast thing that happens. That's part of like the corner rounding. Basically it's looking to see if there's an opening, and if there is, you'll see that red there. It found an opening and decides that the player needs to move towards that opening. In any case, so we're centered on the player here, and of course we're centered on the player here as well. So we can look at both things and see what's happening. So the way this actually works when you go up these stairs here, besides the fact that there's like a stair collider, there's these two colliders here. You'll see this that has this this little kind of pawn looking thing. So what these do actually is they set your sort layer, which you can possibly read here. I'm gonna try to make this a little bigger so that you can maybe read these, because I made those a little small. But in any case, so this is a little bit of debug info that shows some things, but the thing we're looking at right here is this bottom thing where it says walking maze area lower. So that's the current sort layer. So if you watch the previous video, you'll understand that kind of the way Unity does sorting is that you have a sorting layer, and then you can have a order in that layer. So the way that I do the sorting for this game is that the player is always at order in layer 0, but I move them around from sorting layer to sorting layer depending on where they need to be. So as you go up these stairs, you'll hit this second collider here that then sets the player's sort layer to dice area lower. And of course, if they move back down, it sets them the other way. And if they go over here, then they'll be set to walking maze area upper, which then puts them on top of this bridge, basically. So that's the sort for there. Now, if you were watching up here instead, you may have noticed that a bunch of these colliders became active as I traveled up here. Well, you can't really see that. Let me zoom out a little bit. Actually, let's do this again. Okay, so what you'll see also when I go over here down these stairs is you'll see a bunch of colliders switch. So this is a second part of handling these sorting systems. So it's a bit tangential, but it's still important, which is that if you're going to have these types of things, you also need to be able to handle collision for those multiple layers, right? Which is why we're just showing you colliders here as well. I could just turn off colliders and you could just see the triggers. But the way I handle this is I use what's called a player Z value. So that's just something that I created. And this can just be changed. So right now it's, sorry, Unity gets a little bit weird sometimes with locking the cursor into the viewport. So right now you can see that the player Z is 1, and then it's 0 when I go back up here. It doesn't have to necessarily have any relationship to the actual player's depth, but it's just a value that I set in order to determine certain things. So I decided here that I wanted for the top of the plateau that the player Z would be 1, and when you're down in this canyon here, your player Z would be 0. So what that allows me to do is I can have a secondary thing that's looking at that player Z, and whenever it sees that it's 1, it will disable all the colliders for the canyon down here, and it'll enable all the colliders for the top of the plateau. So that's what you're seeing here when I go over down this stair. You'll see that there's, let me turn off colliders. Whoops, turn off colliders. So you can just see triggers. So you'll see that there's a trigger here. It may be a little hard to read, but this trigger here sets player Z to 1 when player Z is 0. So when we go over here, that's going to set the player Z to 1. So now you'll see that it's 1. When I go back up here, this sets it to 0. Now you'll see that it's 0. So these colliders essentially do that so that I'll use the term collider and trigger kind of interchangeably because they are essentially the same thing in Unity. It's just a difference between whether or not they affect the collision system or whether they just send a an on trigger callback to your mono behaviors. Anyway, so that's kind of the two ways that I primarily handle this. I know this is like a bit rambly, but it is a bit of a complicated system. I mean, it isn't really, but it's complicated to explain it if I haven't really thought about ever explaining it before. So that leaves the next thing, which I'm going to just excuse me, I'm going to turn off clipping here so I can just walk through the colliders. So the next thing that I would want to talk about is the fading out, fading in thing. So you'll see that like this fades out and fades back in. For whatever reason, the trigger here is not tagged, so we're not seeing it. I can turn everything back on and then you would see it. But there's a trigger here that sets camera Z to -1. So when I hit here, camera Z gets set to -1. And when I hit here, camera Z gets set to 0. So much like the player Z, you'll see that here, camera Z -1, camera Z 0. Let's get our colliders back on and our triggers back on as well, even though those aren't flagged. So much like with the player Z, I have a camera Z, and the camera Z determines whether or not these groups should fade in or out. So the fading gets handled by a totally different system, which is well outside of the realm of what I could actually reasonably cover in a short video like this. But suffice to say that you essentially end up with a group of objects, or you've got a game object that is your root object, and that has a component attached to it that handles this fading. And again, it's just listening for that camera Z to change, and then it handles fading that in or out. So anyway, I don't know how useful this type of information is because a lot of this is very specific to the game that I'm making, but certainly the moving you from one sort layer to another, I think, and keeping the player at 0 in whatever sort layer they're in is probably a generally applicable Unity approach, right? So you'll just see that as I move around, these sort layers change because there's different triggers there, and that allows me to kind of control in a more, I guess, granular fashion as you move around the world how I want things to be sorted, right? So like this gallery area becomes a little bit more complicated because we've got like floor 0 and then floor 1 and then floor 2 and then floor 3. So we've got all these different floors that we have to move between, disabling colliders and re-enabling colliders, which I guess I can show you that again. Although we will want to go nothing and then go colliders and then triggers, and hopefully we'll actually be able to see that. That's not the player. Okay, so let's see what we can see here. So we can certainly see the colliders for this first floor here. And we're not following the player again. I guess we have to hit shift. There we go, okay. So as we go up these, you'll see the colliders switch, and now we've got staircase collider there, and as we go up here, the colliders switch again. So essentially, that's just the type of thing, that's the way you do this. Sounds like, you'd think that there's some kind of fancy system to make all of this easy to do, but it really is just a lot of elbow grease of setting up all of these different colliders and things. In any case, that pretty much covers what I wanted to talk about for the topic of the week. I apologize that it was a little bit rambly, but it always is when I'm kind of trying to talk about tech stuff, especially if I haven't talked about it off the cuff that much. But thanks for watching. Hopefully you learned something. And if you have any questions, please leave those in the comments below, and I'll try to address those. I'm sure there's something that I left out here or some important detail that I missed. Have a good one, everybody. I'll see you around.